Grace and peace to you in the name of God the Creator, Christ the Redeemer, and the Spirit who sustains us. Amen. This is an unsettling story. I'm not a fan of horror movies. I've never seen The Exorcist or really any movie that I can think of where demon possession plays a major part in the plotline. But when I read the label this person carries, demoniac, and the description of their behaviors, unable to be restrained, no one strong enough to subdue them, cutting themselves over and over with stones, howling without cease. It reminds me of the previews I've seen for all those movies. The ones that make me shudder a little bit and think, no thanks, I'll skip that one. At least partly due to pop culture, we have pretty strong and very specific reactions to the idea of demon possession. And because our reactions are so specific, we can justify limiting our thinking to people we can other without feeling guilty. That makes it hard for us to interpret what the story might have to say for us. Anytime that happens with a biblical text, I think it's important to ask ourselves why we are reacting to the story the way we are. There are so many texts that we interpret theologically. The story of Noah and the ark, or Jonah, or the events of Pentecost come to mind. Why should we not do the same for this one? Why can we not do the same for this one? This story makes us uncomfortable on so many levels. First, there's the demoniac, and then there's the interaction that Jesus has with Legion. Then there are the pigs that are drowned in the lake, and then the people run Jesus and the disciples out of town. There's just not much in this story that's pleasant. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't read or think about it. Maybe it makes it all the more important for us to consider. And the first thing to think about is the label that's given to the person who meets Jesus and the disciples. Starting in verse 4, this person is referred to as a demoniac. But if we go back to the Greek and read through the text, we discover that the primary label that is applied to this person is someone with an unclean spirit. So we're talking about someone who is impure, whose spirit has been tainted by sin. So when we take away the exorcist-like images of demon possession that crowd our brains when we read this story, who do we think of who cannot be restrained, who breaks free of shackles and cannot be subdued, who gashes themselves with stones and cries and wails without stopping? I think of people who are so corrupted by the love of power and money that they will do anything to gain more of both, no matter what it costs or who it hurts. And I think of their victims. If you're familiar with the Marvel comics, you might think about someone like Kingpin, who is Daredevil's arch nemesis, or you might think about Loki. If you look at the world stage, you might think about someone like Putin. But more often, it's the people who lie to get what they want, or who lash out in anger and jealousy. It's the people who practice selfishness over generosity. It's the person trapped in poverty who can't get a break. It's the person who has heard the lie about their lack of self-worth so many times that they believe it to be true. It's the person, either powerful or powerless, who cannot be convinced into accepting generosity or into believing they are loved. It's the one who is in bondage to sin and cannot free themselves. That is the person who meets Jesus on the shore of the lake. This person has been ostracized from their community. Their family and friends have abandoned them, and they have nowhere to go except the graveyard, a ritually unclean place. There were important ritual taboos around encountering dead bodies for Jews and for other peoples in the ancient world, and for good reason. Dead bodies could spread disease. But this person is so alone, so isolated. They have nowhere else to go. And uncleanness of spirit is compounded by being forced to live in a place where no one should have to live, in a place that probably only served to increase their isolation and sense of despair, until they were so desperate for relief of some kind that they gashed themselves with stones. The person was so deeply enslaved to the evil and sin that possessed them. They recognized that only Jesus could free them from this possession, but somehow even the thought of being clean, being freed from sin, felt like torture. "What do you want with me, Jesus, firstborn of the Most High God?" the person asks, recognizing Jesus' divinity, even in this Gentile land where Jesus is unknown. Legion, the person names themselves, after the Roman legion, which had 6,000 soldiers at full strength. Can you imagine being possessed and consumed by 6,000 types of uncleanness, 6,000 types of sin, from anger to jealousy to fear to greed to desperate, all-consuming loneliness, all weighing down on you until you feel like there is nothing left in your life but despair? And if all you have left is despair, what remains if you give that up? We don't know why the demons requested to be sent into the pigs, but this is an important moment in this story. Mark writes, "Now there was a large herd of pigs feeding on the mountainside, and the unclean spirits begged Jesus, 'Send us to the pigs so we can enter them.' Jesus gave them permission." The important thing here is the power dynamic at play between Jesus and the unclean spirits. Jesus is more powerful than the unclean spirits, and they recognize this. They cannot enter the pigs without Jesus allowing them to do so. And so the spirits enter the herd of 2,000 pigs and rush over the cliff and are drowned in the lake. Now, my immediate thought whenever I read this part of the story is to wonder about the ecological impact of 2,000 pigs drowning in a lake. What will that do to the town's water supply? What will that do to the fishing in the area? Will the whole lake be contaminated or just a part of it? How long will the effects of this last? There are other reactions to this too. The other major reaction that people tend to have is economic. While Jews considered pigs to be unclean animals, Gentiles did not. They were raised like any other commodity animal, like goats, sheep, or cattle, for what they could provide to the farmer in terms of food and financial security. In today's dollars, one hog is worth about $1,000 on the market. So the pig farmer who owned that herd would have lost about $2 million in today's money. So that was a big investment that ended up at the bottom of the lake. But I was confronted with something this week when I listened to the podcast I use as part of my sermon prep. I think about the ecological or maybe the financial impacts to the town with the destruction of the pigs, but I have never thought about the suffering of the person with the unclean spirit. And this is the thing about Jesus. We saw this when the 4 faithful people lowered their paralytic friend through the roof of Jesus' home. We see it in this morning's text with the driving out of the unclean spirits, and we will see it again as Mark's gospel continues to unfold. There is no price that Jesus is not willing to pay to save even one single person. And he does save this person living with the unclean spirits. When he drives the spirits into the pigs and over the cliff, he shows the person that there is more to life than despair, anger, and fear. There is love and generosity and healing in the world. But the people in town don't want any part of that. Unlike the people in Galilee, they have no trouble believing that a miracle occurred. They accept at face value that someone who has been ostracized and driven to despair is now of sound mind, able to exercise control over their actions. And the crowd want nothing to do with Jesus. In fact, they beg him to leave. They can't get rid of him fast enough. And Jesus complies, but he leaves behind the one who has been healed as a missionary. Again, in this text, we see Jesus showing us who he is by confounding expectations. By refusing to avoid people who are unclean, by refusing to avoid those who live among the dead, by refusing to place the health and economic security of a community that has ostracized one of their own above the well-being of someone who desperately needs him. Jesus shows us that he shows up when no one and nothing else will make a difference. This is the time of fulfillment, Jesus proclaimed after John's arrest. The reign of God is at hand. Change your hearts and minds and believe this good news. How do we receive this good news that has the power to unnerve us so much? Do we sit in our discomfort, asking ourselves why we are uncomfortable and how God is speaking to us in the midst of this? Do we write it off and ostracize the ones who are out of control with grief or despair or anger? Do we run Jesus out of town? Or do we welcome those who suffer and try to point to Jesus? Amen.